Okay, I want to welcome everyone today to Museum Studies' third webinar of 2023. I guess that should be 3.2 since you did it this morning. Introduction to Collection Management Policies. I am Brad Reedy Huff with Museum Study. Museum Study provides online professional development for people who work in or with cultural institutions. I see a few people here already who have participated in our courses, including one of our instructors, Lori Benson. Today's presentation will be by another one of our instructors, John Simmons. John is a museum consultant, author, educator, and curator. You may know him as the author of Things Great and Small Collections Management Policy. He has authored more than 150 popular and technical articles and books on museum studies and natural history topics, including Museum Registration Methods, Volume 6, which he edited with Tony Kaiser. John leads our 4-week-long online course, Policies for Managing Collections, that will run in July this year, which I see at least one person here I think is already registered for. John also leads our Laws and Collection Management course that will run in August this year. We are excited to have such a large group of you from all manner of cultural institutions and collections, as we have some corporations represented. More than 160 participants from, at least, as I said a while ago, 23 countries on 6 continents. For some reason, Antarctica didn't join us. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. I will send a link to the recording.
That's the thing, because when I was looking to get my hydro put on,
and we have some people who aren't muted.
When I called Hydro One, I told them the address, and I'm like,
there, that's better. Okay, now where was I? The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. I will send a link to the recording to all who registered for today's webinar once it is available. Please mute yourself during the presentation, but feel free to use the chat window to ask any questions you have, which John will answer during Q&A after his presentation. At that time, you can also unmute yourself to ask questions. The next webinar in our series will be June 1st. It's the Law, an Introduction to Legal Issues for Collecting Objects, also presented by John Simmons. If you were interested in joining us for that presentation, you can email us at same place you did for this one, webinar@museumstudy.com, and include the title of the webinar. And in fact, I will drop that into the chat right now, so you have that. There it is. That's it for me, John. I will let you take over.
All right, I will take over the screen here. All right, can you see the screen all right?
Yes.
All right, so thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you today about collections management policies and why they are important. And although writing policies can be tedious, it is an important aspect of collection management that should not be neglected. So let's start by thinking about the commonalities, what all collecting institutions have in common. So these are some colleagues of mine in Colombia looking at a collection object. This is something all of us probably do at one time or another, but what is it that we all do? And what we all do is we, of course, collect objects. We accumulate a collection of them. We then make a list of these objects, which is to say we initiate documentation of the collection. And we then have to decide which objects we want to keep for our collection and which objects we do not want to keep. In other words, the staff has to make accession decisions. And there are many kinds of things collected in museums, from art museums to history to natural history. And rather than trying to say objects and artifacts and specimens, I'm going to reduce it all down to just objects today. So when I'm talking about objects, I'm including artifacts and natural history specimens. But we decide what to keep for the collection. We then go through the process of registration, which involves the identification, authentication, evaluation, accession, cataloging, numbering, and marking of the objects. And we then take those that we have accessioned, and we assign them to a place in the collection storage array where they can be used. And through all of these steps, we very carefully document everything that is done with the objects. Over time, as objects are used, and they are used in exhibition and education and for research, the condition of the objects and their storage conditions is monitored. And at some point, if the object becomes no longer useful to the museum, it will be deaccessioned. And that's pretty much sums up the commonalities. All museums have these things in common. And so we will take a look at policies from that point of view. So even though museum collections are astoundingly diverse, the processes that we use to acquire objects, accession them, and use them and take care of them are very similar in all museums. So I'll go back to an even more fundamental question, which is, why do we collect objects and put them in museums to begin with? And the answer is that objects, including specimens and artifacts, are part of our material culture. In other words, they're the things that human beings use to understand the world around them. In large part, we make sense of the world around us by assembling collections. And humans are storytellers, so our objects are, our stories are reflected in museum collections, which of course is why people go to visit museums, is to learn those stories. But it's important to remember that it is not the collections that make the museum, it is the interactions that take place between people and the collections that really make the museum. So I'll take a look at this image. This is revisitors in a museum gallery. And I like to ask my students, what do you think is happening in this image? And frequently the answer I get is nothing is happening. It's just three people sitting in a gallery. But of course, that's not true. What this image really shows is collection management policy in action at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, because the three people sitting in the gallery are each in their own way interacting with objects from the museum's collection, and they are finding meaning in that interaction. And this is, in essence, what museums are all about. Museums provide a place where people can encounter objects. And so for this to happen, the museum needs to be properly managed, which means preserving the objects and the information about them and making both of those things available. So the purpose of collection management policies is to help museums do just that, help them enable people-object interactions to take place. So I'd like to start out with a couple of definitions. The first one is collection management, which can be defined as everything that is done to care for and document the collection and make it available for use. And this means it encompasses acquisition, accession, registration, cataloging, care, use, and those uses are primarily exhibition, education, and research. Deaccession, disposal of objects, the care of their associated information, as well as things like collection security, conservation, storage, and access. And for this reason, collection management is the only operation in the museum that has a direct impact on all other activities in the museum. All are involved with the collection at some level. The museum exists in large part because it has collections or uses collections. And so all these activities needed to be guided by policies to help the staff make good decisions, because your collection management policies will affect the entire museum's operation. Another way to think about this is to consider the collection management tasks in three rather broad categories. The care of the collection includes accession, registration, and cataloging of objects, keeping the collection storage array in order, the way we put things in storage, periodic collection inventories, because it's important for us to know what we have and where it is, and also providing good, clear instructions for how to handle objects. The use of the collection includes access to the objects and the information about them, making the objects available for those uses of education, research, and exhibition, loans to other museums, and security of the collection. Preventive conservation, which is the third part of this, is everything that is done to keep the objects in the collection in good condition, such as maintaining a stable storage environment, monitoring that storage environment and the condition of the individual objects, and using inert materials in the collection. The American Alliance for Museums has identified 5 documents that they are calling the core documents for museums, because these documents are fundamental for professional museum operations. These embody museum values and practices. So these core documents codify and guide decisions and actions that promote institutional stability and enable museums to fulfill their research, interpretation, and educational roles to preserve the collections for future generations and thus serve their communities. The 5 core documents are these: the mission statement, the institutional code of ethics, a strategic plan, a disaster preparedness and emergency response plan, and the collection management policy, which of course is what we're going to talk about today. So collection management policy actually is a bit of a misnomer, because a collection management policy is not a single policy, it's actually a set of policies. And these policies clarify who has responsibility for managing the collection and how it's to be managed. The collection management policy is something that needs to be approved by the museum's governing authority. And I'll talk a little bit more about who that governing authority is in a moment. But in short, the collection management policy defines the principles that govern the museum's activities, practices, and operations. Collection management policies should be based on the mission, the history of the institution, the legal and ethical constraints that it's under, and recognize professional standards and best practices. So we'll go through these one at a time. The mission, history, and traditions of the institution and its community are important. Is the museum primarily a research institution, or primarily one that has exhibits? Does it primarily open to the public? Is the focus of this museum local, regional, or international? Is it focused on art, history, natural history, or is it a general institution? So all of these things affect that. The legal and ethical constraints govern how the museum takes possession of objects and uses the objects. And these legal and ethical constraints are largely determined by the museum's governance structure, and these vary widely around the world with different museums. Standards and best practices are often used as synonyms, but in fact, they are very different. Standards are generally accepted and recognized levels of attainment that all museums should achieve. Standards are developed from discussion and consensus within the profession, and they carry the stamp of authority, so they have to be approved by an organization. Typically, this is something that is a large organization, such as ICOM, the International Council of Museums, which is a worldwide museum organization. Or here in the United States, it would be approved by the American Alliance of Museums, or a similar organization. Best practices are generally agreed upon actions that are based on experience and practice of those in the profession, and these are things that can prevent or resolve problems in collection management. Best practices change over time, and they change a lot faster than standards, and they reflect the consensus of the opinion, but they do not need to have the formal approval of a professional organization. So they are a little more relaxed. Collection management policies must be written to meet the needs of each individual institution, its collections, and how those collections are used. A policy should only be created to accomplish a specific goal, address a particular issue, or solve a specific problem. So an example, here at the Earth and Mineral Sciences Museum and Art Gallery at Penn State University, where I am the Associate Curator of Collections, we have a policy that requires the paintings that go on exhibit to be hung with security hardware. And that's what Julianne Snyder, the director, is doing in this image. She's replacing normal hanging hardware with security hardware for an exhibition. The individual policies are going to vary quite a bit from one museum to another. No two museums are alike, no two collections are alike. So each museum needs to develop policies appropriate for its collections and circumstances. You should never just copy the policies from another institution. They're not going to be a good match for your needs and your particular problems. However, the policies of other museums can be very useful to use as models or templates when you're working on policies. So it's important to understand the difference between policies and procedures. Policies relate to the museum's, regulate the museum's activities. They identify what needs to be done. They provide a framework to help the staff make decisions, and they give continuity to the collections management operation by establishing standards for the institution. And as I mentioned before, policies are formally approved by the institutional governing authority. By contrast, Procedures tell the staff how to implement the policies in everyday practice. Procedures provide the mechanisms and the details to carry out the policies. So procedures are a series of succinct and unambiguous action steps developed at the staff level. Because the policies are approved by the institution's governing authority, the procedures, because they're based on the policies, do not require separate approval. So policies and procedures should be separate documents to make it very clear what is policy and what is procedure. That way, the procedures can be revised as often as needed without having to go back and get the approval of the governing authority. And here's an example of the installation of an exhibit at the Tate Britain Gallery. And what you see are staff members out on the floor following the procedures developed from their policies about how a loan is to be handled, how shows are to be installed, how the artwork is to be hung, and all of those other details. The single biggest mistake that I see in the development of collection management policies is the tendency to mix policies and procedures in the same document. It is very important to keep these separate. So remember this very simple equation that policies tell you what to do, procedures tell you how to do it. And the policies, of course, are approved by the governing authority of the museum, while the procedures are developed by staff. And of course, you need both policies and procedures. Here's an example from the Museum for Naturkunde in Berlin, and they have an exhibit of fluid preserved specimens that is visible to the public, and they have to go through quite a number of policies and procedures to ensure the safety of the visitors to the museum. So there are policies regulating the safety of this exhibit and how things are to be handled, and then the procedures that are carried out by the staff day to day. So there are 4 basic ways to develop collection management policies. The worst way to do it is simply copy the policies from another institution and stick your institution's name on them. And this is bad because they are not going to properly address your situations and your problems. Second way to do it is get a museum administrator to write the policies and then demand that the staff follow them. But policies created this way are likely to fail because they are not going to address all of the collection management issues, and nobody likes rules handed down to them from above. A third option is you can hire an outside consultant to work with your staff to write policies. This can work okay, but the best way to develop a good set of policies is to form a staff writing team and have them do the work. If your institution does not have any collection management policies at all, you may find it useful to go online and use the Collection Management Policy Toolkit to help you get started. The URL for this toolkit is in the resource list. In the museum studies class that I teach, the policies for managing collections, all of the participants share the policies they are developing and get input from each other, which produces much better results than trying to work alone. So your steps are, first, assemble a writing team. And the writing team should include a variety of perspectives, including administration, exhibitions, collections, education, security, and I would even go so far as to include the housekeeping staff. And this will give you a big variety of viewpoints on the collection. And remember that in a museum, it is the collections that have an impact on all other operations, and that alone makes it important to get a variety of viewpoints. So you solicit input from all the sectors of the museum staff. And second, you develop a list of the policy issues that you think need to be addressed. And this means identifying the issues that the museum faces and the problems that you want to avoid. The next step is what I call a standards review. You review the literature to find out what the current best practices and standards are, and care in the profession are, and also the current legal and ethical standards and regulations. You then need to collect feedback from the entire museum staff on the policies. So you take your drafts that you've written of the policies, and I recommend circulating the drafts to everyone on staff, giving everyone an opportunity to make comments and read these policies. This does a number of things. It will bring up problems that you've overlooked, and it also gives the staff buy-in. No one likes policies handed down. If the staff have been involved in writing the policies, they will be far more inclined to follow them. You might also want to get input from colleagues in other institutions, particularly if the staff of your institution is very small, because it's always good to have a lot of viewpoints on the policy development. Step 5 is you get the formal government endorsement by the museum's governing authority. This may be a board of trustees. It may be a board of directors. If you are a government museum, it may be a ministry or a government agency. If you're a university museum, it's probably going to be a board of directors or trustees that is many steps above the university president or provost, but somewhere up there is the group that is ultimately responsible for the museum, and you want their approval of these policies. This formal approval is what gives collection management policies their power, is they come from the governing authority. So you need to be prepared to explain and defend the policies, as well as to incorporate suggestions that you get from members of the governing authority. Once the policies have been approved, then the staff can develop procedures for implementing them. And remember that the procedures are there to provide guidance to the staff on how to carry out the policies in everyday practice. But procedures should not be developed until the policies are approved. It's only at that point that they are finalized. And finally, you implement the policies. You put them to work and see what happens. It will be necessary to periodically review and revise the policies and the procedures, because no policy lasts forever. What you want to do is make sure each policy is doing what it's supposed to do. It's recommended that you set up a regular schedule for policy review. Most museums use either a 3-year or a 5-year schedule where they check on their policies. But also, you should review policies whenever there is a policy failure, whenever a policy isn't followed, or when it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. So you look for signs of problems, look for policies that aren't followed. If their policies are not doing what they're supposed to, find out. If the staff isn't following the policies appropriately, find out. My experience working with museums on policies has been generally when a policy doesn't work, the problem is usually not the policy. It's usually the procedure. And at that point, you can refine the procedures to get the policy to work. And that's a lot easier than having to rewrite the policy. But sometimes rewriting the policy is necessary. There is a growing expectation that we should have transparency in how public institutions operate. This is in order, and I think this is a very good thing, to be as transparent as possible about our operations. And in order to be more transparent about how they do business, many collecting institutions now make their collection management policies available to the public, generally through their website. I think this is a really good practice, and all museums should follow it. And so if you are starting out to write collection management policies, try Googling collection management policies in museums, and you'll find a number of museums, from very large ones to very small ones, that have their policies online so that you can see them. And it's a good example to look at a template of other people's policies. So a few other policy considerations. Collection management policies help the museum staff carry out their duties by defining the areas of staff responsibility, delegating decision-making authority to the appropriate individuals, and identifying who has the authority to make exceptions to the policies when it's necessary, and directing the staff to maintain complete written records regarding all collection-related decisions and activities. And this is an important aspect of it, because those written records are how you determine whether your policies are working or not. You want to make sure that the collections care staff are given the appropriate authority to carry out their responsibilities for the collections care. All too often when working with museums, I have found that the staff is given the responsibility for collections care, but not given the authority to make the decisions necessary to care for the collection. This is a mistake. They need to, if they're going to be given responsibility, they need the authority to carry out that responsibility. So good collection management policies can help you avoid this conundrum by clarifying the authority necessary for all the levels of responsibility. So what should the policies address? This is a question I get a lot. The answer is it's going to depend on the institution. Each institution needs to establish policies to prevent or resolve particular problems that it faces, so no two are going to be alike. And remember that it's pointless to write policies that you don't need in your institution, so you shouldn't write a policy just because another museum has one like it, but focus on things that you need. So what should policies address? This is a list of common collection management policies, but of course, no museum ever needs all of these. The general categories of policies are administrative policies, ethics, personnel policies, stewardship of the collection, documentation, intellectual property concerns, interpretation of objects in the collection, legal issues and liabilities, and risk management. And one of the things that we do in the policies for managing collections class I teach for museum study is help each person figure out which policies they really need in their particular museum. So the list on the previous slide came from the book Things Great and Small, Collection Management Policies, which includes more information and discussion about what to include in the policy document. And it's the textbook that we use for the class. But, and this is really important, keep in mind that some institutions may need policies to address that are not on that list. The list is intended to be a guide to help you figure out the policies you need, but of course, it's not exhaustive. No list of policies ever is, because there is no limit to the number of policy issues that museums may face. So I'll give you an example, a rather simplified example of how collection management policies should work in practice. So I like frogs, so let us assume that we need to prepare an accession policy for the International Museum of Authentic Frog Art. What should we say? Well, first, the accession policy needs to be based on the institutional mission, and that they happen to have one. It is this: the International Museum of Authentic Frog Art collects, exhibits, and interprets art featuring representations of real frogs and toads to help people appreciate their value as part of the Earth's biodiversity. So a nice, simple, clear mission. So what would you put in an accession policy for this institution? And of course, remember what we discussed earlier, that the policy should be based on the mission, history, and traditions of the institution and its community, on the legal and ethical constraints governing how the museum acquires and uses objects in its collections, and on the museum's governance structure, and of course, standards and best practices. And in this case, the accession policy of the International Museum of Authentic Frog Arts needs to say that the objects and artwork collected for the collection must be quality works of art. They must depict fossil or recent species of frogs or toads in artistic, cultural, and historic ways. The objects must be legally obtained, and they must be appropriately documented and have clear provenance. And by provenance, I mean a clear history of ownership to make sure that the museum does not inadvertently acquire an object that has been stolen. So that's pretty straightforward. That's pretty simple. We can write that policy pretty well, but how will we apply it in practice? So we're going to consider 3 objects that have been offered to the museum for accession and decide whether we should accept any of these for the collection. So the 3 objects are, from left to right, a frog teapot, silicon molds of frogs made from frogs in a museum collection that were created by an artist who specialized in interpreting natural history collections, and a stuffed toad playing a harp. So think about these. Which of these 3, if any, would you accept, given the museum's mission and the caveats on the accession of objects that we reviewed for this collection? So let's go over these one at a time. So the frog-shaped teapot, although it is stunningly beautiful, unfortunately does not fit the museum's collecting criteria because it is not a representation of a real frog species. So even though the curator may really want this object in the collection, you are going to have to tell the curator no, because this is contrary to the museum's mission. It was legally obtained and it was documented, but it fits all of these other criteria, but it does not fit in with what the museum is supposed to collect. It's contrary to the museum's mission, history, and traditions. And so therefore, according to the accession policy, the curator is not going to get that teapot in the collection. So how about the stuffed toad playing a harp? Well, this one happens to be made from a real toad, so it does fit the mission of history, tradition, and authenticity, but it lacks documentation, and this could be a problem. Now, we know what the animal was that it was made from. It's a cane toad, Rhinella morena, because we had an expert look at it. And we know that this toad occurs in Mexico, Central and South America, but the problem is we have no idea when or how it was imported into the United States. In addition to the lack of collecting permits, export and import permits, there may also be a problem of compliance with international wildlife laws, such as CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna. So, according to our criteria in the accession policy for the International Museum of Authentic Frog Art, this object cannot be accepted either. And that brings us to the last object. So what about the silicon cast made from frog specimens in museum collections and donated by the artist? Well, these happen to meet all of the museum's criteria for accession. They're quality art objects, they're representations of real frog species, they were legally obtained, and they're very well documented. So these can be accepted into the collection. So this is how policies should work. The policy should establish clear guidelines. The procedures should be laid out so that you can follow these guidelines and avoid making accessions of objects that you're never going to use and are going to use up a lot of your collection stewardship resources. That's the ideal. So, although we don't have time to discuss every topic that should be covered by collection management policies today, I do want to briefly mention collection care and stewardship policy. This is a really important one, and it's always more complicated than we expect it to be. Ideally, every object in the collection should receive the same level of care. But in practice, this is usually not possible due to limitations of budget and constraints on staff time. So for this reason, the collections care and stewardship policy can establish a framework for prioritizing collections care, deciding which objects should receive more care than others. The policy should be based on the principles of preventive conservation, which is fundamental to collections care. And remember that I said preventive conservation refers to everything that is done to prolong the useful life of the objects by preventing deterioration and the loss of object information. And this includes such things as maintaining a stable storage environment with minimal fluctuations of temperature and humidity, limiting the exposure of objects to light and ultraviolet radiation, and using inert materials in the collection, and including guidelines for careful handling and use. But collections care and stewardship policies are going to vary in the level of detail they provide. Most should address the staff responsibilities. There should be something in there about the importance of maintaining a stable storage environment and the need for regular collection monitoring. But there's another problem, and that is sometimes our preferred or ideal storage environment policy may be in conflict with other museum policies. Such as energy savings in green buildings, because most green buildings are designed to operate over a very wide range of temperature and relative humidity, and that can be a problem. Another instance where this comes up, and this is very common in the United States, if you have Native American objects that are considered to be sacred or culturally sensitive, you may have a policy that requires them to be subjected to ritual cleaning with sage smoke or ritual feeding with corn pollen. These are both very common things that are done in native care of collections. And of course, both of these, cleansing your object with sage smoke and feeding them with corn pollen, are contrary to the principles of preventive conservation. So what you have to do is consider what are the long-term effects of inappropriate temperature, humidity, and handling on the objects, or some of these other things you might do, and then consider the importance of the objects and why you have these other rules in place, and find a compromise solution. And if, for example, in many museums, they have a separate room that does not have smoke detectors where objects can be taken to be cleansed with sage smoke, and situations such as that. So there's always a compromise that you can find, but you'll need to work that out very carefully. Well, policies don't do any good if they're not followed, so I want to spend a little bit of time considering how policies should be managed. And we'll begin with a few things that I've learned through my consulting work with collection management policies. And the first one is involve the staff as much as you can in the process of developing policies and especially writing the procedures. So let the staff comment on drafts of policies before they're finalized. Some members of the staff may notice problems and issues that the writing team doesn't. And of course, remember what I said before, nobody likes rules that are just handed down to them from above. If you hire a consultant to write your collection management policies, make sure that person meets with the staff several times, multiple times during policy development so that they listen to the staff. And don't just take a written copy of your policies and send it up to the governing authority and expect them to read it and understand it. Be prepared to explain what the policies say and why they say it. And remember that most of the members of the governing authority are probably not museum professionals, and so they're going to need some explanation. And lastly, don't be afraid to change a policy if it isn't working. No policy lasts forever, and these things just sometimes have to be fixed. So why are some policies successful and others not? A friend of mine, the late Stephen Williams, did an analysis of policy failure in museums, and he pointed out several things. He started with saying that it's important to get back to basics and recognize that the primary purpose of policies is to manage people so that the organizational goals are achieved. Because we think of these policies as managing the collection, but of course the policies really manage the people who manage the collection. And Steve found in his study that policies can be ineffective due to three reasons: inappropriate concerns, inappropriate processes, or inappropriate products. So inappropriate concerns means things like institutions that do not have policies, or policies that are unwritten, which are terrible because they can never be transmitted accurately to the staff, or policies that are not enforced consistently, because if you're going to have a policy, it should be enforced consistently. Inappropriate processes include the failure to include all sectors of the museum staff in policy development, or the lack of support for the policies from the museum's governing authority, which is why you should take those policies to the governing authority for a formal approval. And one of the most common process errors is that one of using the policies from another organization and applying them to your own without thinking about your own organization's particular collections and needs. Inappropriate policy products include policy manuals that are too large to be read easily, policies that are too complex, or policies that are too confusing to be easily understood and implemented, policies that contain gaps or redundancies or contradictions, or policies that are outdated. So, because the purpose of the collection management policies is to help the institution achieve its mission and goals, if policies fail, or when the mission and goals change, policies will need to be reviewed and probably revised. Approach these situations with an attitude of creative compromise in which the spirit of the law takes precedence over the letter of the law. In other words, stay focused on what the policy is supposed to do, not on the little details. To resolve the situation, conduct a review to determine how the policy can be improved to be more effective. We should never expect our policies to be perfect, although we should certainly strive to make them as good as we can make them. We can expect policies to change as the organization grows and changes, and that makes it necessary, and it becomes necessary to meet new institutional missions and goals. And as is the case with any profession, museum professional standards change and evolve over time to accommodate innovations in practice, in theory, and technology, and to respond to new challenges. And in the end, the ultimate test of a policy is, does it help the staff, the volunteers, and the governing authority fulfill the museum's mission? And I have one more suggestion for getting your staff involved in policies and getting them to think about how policies can help them do a better job. And that is, get them to play the monopolicy game. So the resource list includes a link to the URL where you can download a free PDF of this game, courtesy of Brad, along with instructions on how to make the game board and play the game. Even I, who am supposedly an expert on collection management policies, think that policy development can be pretty boring. So I invented this game to make it more interesting and to make the discussions more fun. The idea is the museum staff can sit down and play the game together and develop a better idea a better understanding of how resources and policies should be used to solve or prevent problems in collection management. So the players roll a dice and they move around the game board like you typically do in a board game. And as they do that, they draw policy cards and resource cards out of a stack. And when players land on a problem square, they have to use those policy and resource cards to figure out how to solve that particular problem. The game is designed to promote discussion among the staff so players are encouraged to talk and to trade policy and resource cards with each other each time a problem is encountered. The game also comes with blank cards so you can customize it to better fit your own institution by putting in those resources, problems, and policies which you might have. And I've used this game quite a bit. As I mentioned, the link is in the resource list. And here are some examples of the game being played in workshops across the United States, in Colombia, and in Qatar. And I've had great success internationally with this game, so I know that it works. But it does get the staff working together and can be a lot more fun than simply talking about policies. So as you develop collection management policies and implement them in your institution, keep in mind the big picture. First, the three components of collection management: care of the collection, use of the collection, and preventive conservation. Second, the three considerations of policies for your museum: the mission, history, and traditions of the institution and the community that it serves; the legal and ethical constraints governing how the museum acquires and uses objects in the museum's governance structure; and the standards and best practices in the museum field. This will allow you to develop policies that solve collection management problems, prevent most problems from occurring, and provide guidance for how you can manage your collection. So a carefully considered and regularly revised collection management policy should provide guidance for what objects are added to the collection, why and how those objects are added, how the objects are used once they're in the collection, how the collection is cared for, and the standards of professional conduct for the museum employees. Good, clear policies are supported by the governing authority and the museum staff, and then that way they can prevent problems from occurring or help you quickly resolve problems when they do occur. So I thank Brad for organizing and hosting this webinar, and I thank all of you for listening to this talk about collection management policies, and good luck writing and implementing policies in your institution. And I will now be happy to entertain any questions that you might have. So I'll stop the screen share here and turn it back over to Brad.
I don't know how entertaining you are, but you can answer them. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. There haven't been any yet, John. Also, if you would prefer to ask them in person, you can feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question. You can also raise your hand and I'll call them. Pat has a question. Go ahead, Pat.
Hello, thank you so much for this very helpful information. John, you said, I think, that it's best to have the policies written and approved first before going on to establishing the procedures. But it's been my experience that the governing authorities, those who are ultimately going to, vote yes or no, want to know what the procedures are likely to be. So I would imagine you have to come up with at least, an overview, a guideline, a synopsis to let them know that you just don't say X is the policy and then we'll figure out later. You approve it and then we'll figure out later how to implement it.
Well, you can always make your governing authority take the course. Your policy needs to be clear what the aim to be achieved is. And that's one reason that you should be prepared to defend the policies in front of the board. But you don't want to get down into the nitty gritty of the procedures to carry out the policy, because that has to be established by the staff because they know how things work. There's a real tendency, because you're working on the policies and this is going to be this is how we should do do this. There's a real tendency to go ahead and write the procedures at the same time and put those in the policy because you're thinking about how it will be carried out. But it's really not a good idea, because what you need is the staff members who are carrying out that policy to be the ones who come up with the procedures. But if the policy is well written, then the procedures should follow that and should be fine. But and then you can also point out to the board that one way you measure the effectiveness of a policy is whether the procedures are operating correctly. And if they're not, then you can change them. But you should be able to address that by writing a policy where it's pretty clear what the procedures are going to be. And that comes down to a governing board that probably wants to micromanage to a degree they shouldn't. But, you all should also point out that your staff are professionals and they will be able to enact this policy and carry it out. But it requires a bit of diplomacy, and it requires a really nicely written policy.
Thank you.
Anyone else have questions? Oh, something just popped up in the chat. Carolyn says she works with a nonprofit who has a collection that we are finally starting to document. Given that we are not a museum, but are caring for a collection that will be exhibited, loaned out, and cared for, how does this impact the types of policies that we develop? What kinds of policies should be most beneficial?
As a collecting institution using those collections, that is essentially the same as a museum. So even though you don't call yourself a museum, you should follow the same general collection management policies. You look at how similar your operation is going to be. And so you say that you have this collection and you're caring for it and you're going to exhibit it and loan it out. Those are all things museums do. So you should look at I'd start with looking at list of policies in other institutions and in the book and decide which are applicable to the way you run your organization. But there are a lot of collecting institutions other than museums. And in fact, that's one reason that the book is subtitled Collection Management Policies for Collecting Institutions rather than for museums. It's interesting to keep in mind that the American Alliance of Museums defines museums very well. They don't define museums. They consider museums to include a very broad variety of organizations, including botanical gardens, zoos, planetariums, things of that order. Any organization that is making collections or using collections is considered by the AM to be a museum. The accreditation committee of the AAM does have a definition of museums. AAM officially does not have a definition, but they like to keep that tent very broad and include all collecting institutions within it because of the similarities.
Carolyn says, thank you.
Okay.
And I posted in the chat that you've actually had corporations with corporate collections take the class in the past.
Yeah. And even, of course, there are some private collections that are big enough that they are run by professional staff that will also have policies.
I think Mel Party had a question. She had her hand up, but then it went away. Ah, there we go. Is there a role for policies for subsections of a museum?
If subsections are doing something completely different than other parts of the museum, yes, but you should make sure everyone is aware of what your policies are, because ultimately the collection management policies do affect all parts of the museum. But you're saying like archaeology and geology or art and geology, yes, and that is very true. You will need separate policies for certain collections, and even in the small museum where I volunteer as the curator of collections, It has a collection of art that depicts extractive industries. It has a mineral collection, and it has collection of mine safety equipment and other mining equipment. But it has an overall collection management policy where each of those collections is considered for its own particular needs, because the way you manage each of those collections, of course, is a little bit different. So yeah, so that's perfectly reasonable if it's a very complex institution. But I do encourage you not to keep policies just within a subsection, but to make sure everybody knows what policies are. Share that information widely within your institution.
So in a case like that, where you have an institution that has a lot of different departments, would you have one overarching policy for the institution and then sub-policies for the different departments?
It depends on what they're doing, because you probably will have an overarching accessioning policy and collection use policy. But it depends entirely on the nature of the institution. This is why it is so risky to merely adopt policies from another place. You really need to look at how your institution functions, how centralized your administration is, how much authority the different levels are given, for instance, at curatorial level, management level, and you really need to take all those into consideration. So it's not something that can be just easily answered with one example. It really depends on how the institution is to be structured.
Yes, and as we know, institutions can vary widely, and universities even differ from university to university.
Right. Well, for university museums are a particular point of concern, because often the university museum manages the university's collection. They exhibit it, they loan it out, they do research, but they don't own it. Typically, the university owns the collection, which raises some very interesting collection management policy concerns, particularly regarding deaccessioning, trading objects from the collection with others. So this goes back to your governance, how it's set up, what are the legal constraints that your institution is working under. We've not had time to go into all that kind of level of detail in just one webinar, but these are big considerations that you need to keep in mind when crafting policies.
If anyone has any questions, you can either drop them in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask it.
Hello, my name is Anna Nino, and I'm the librarian at Fort Worth Botanic Garden. My apologies earlier for not having my mic muted. I wanted to ask if in crafting collection management policies, if typically you have seen for institutions that have various types of collections. For instance, in our case, we have a library, we have archives, and we have art, whether there are 3 distinct collection management policies, or if some collapse them all into one, if it's just a matter of, what your institution's preference is, I guess, as far as that goes.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. First off, greetings to my city of my birth. I'm from Fort Worth, and
Nice.
my first job after college was at the Fort Worth Zoo, as a matter of fact.
Oh, very good.
So that was back in the Pleistocene, of course, when there were still mammoths roaming the earth. So in answer to your question, I have seen both, and it doesn't really depend so much on the size of the institution as on how much overlap there is among functions. And a botanical garden, of course, is a really good example, because you are likely to have, I presume, herbarium collections as well, library, all of that stuff. And it depends on the overlap. I am personally in favor of single collection management policies whenever possible, because you should have people accessing all aspects of the institution, and the people working in the institution should be thinking of it in terms of the overall institution rather than just the sector they work in. But in some cases, your collections may be specialized enough that it's necessary to break those out into separate policies. But I would argue for overall institutional policy. This will also give you more reason to bring people from all aspects of the institution, all sectors together to develop your policies. But, these are where it gets down to how specialized institutions can be and the particular problems that you deal with.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that for the purposes of the library's collections management policy, I will probably go ahead and include the library, the archives, and the art
Yeah.
all in one, versus we do plan to have separate ones for our herbarium and our living collections, for instance. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and you have issues, of course, with living collections, whether it's flora or fauna that you do not have with other kinds of collections. And in that sense, it may be necessary to separate those out.
Yes, exactly.
We
There
actually
is,
have,
I don't know if you're aware of it, there is a book on curatorial practices for botanical gardens.
Yes, I think I became aware
Okay.
of that.
All right.
That looks like an older edition.
That
but yeah, I'll
is
have
an
to look
older
into it.
edition, yeah.
Okay, nice.
Right.
Thanks.
I think we actually have someone from a botanical garden taking the class in July.
Oh, okay.
We have some questions in the chat now. First from John O'Malley. Should policies be overridden, and under what circumstances and by whom?
Yeah, well, they shouldn't be overridden, although from time to time there will be some situation in which they need to be, because no policy is perfect. This is why it should be clear in your policy document who has that authority. That should be an authority at a high level of administration, someone to take responsibility for overriding it. And you should try to clarify the situation in which that will happen. And overrides should be done very cautiously. If you need to override a policy very often, it's time to revise that policy. But I would go up to, say, the director level or someone below that, maybe curator. But you want to be very careful about this, because you don't want the person who is overriding the decision to have a vested interest in that outcome. For example, if you have a collection accessioning policy that defines what you collect, and you allow curator to override it, the curator probably is going to be far more interested in obtaining objects that are along the lines of their research or their particular interest. And that would be a conflict of interest for the curator to be overriding that. But if it goes up to a director, that could be a much more objective point. But yes, there should be an overriding clause in the policies, but it should be very difficult to do that. And it should be done very, very rarely.
All right, we have another question from Joanna McCann. How do you strike a balance between policies being too detailed and too ambiguous?
If the policy is written so that the staff can read the policy and easily develop procedures to carry it out, and does not feel that they are too constrained by that, then it's at a good level of detail. If the policy when a policy gets too detailed, what that usually means is procedures are creeping into policy, and those should be eliminated. If the policy is so general that it doesn't really tell you what to do, like the policy says, we will only collect good objects, that's pretty lousy. It doesn't give you direction. So the policy should give you direction, but not tell you exactly how to do it. The procedures should tell you how. And it's a bit of a tricky thing, but this is one of the problems that comes down to separation of policies and procedures. In writing policies, the temptation to include procedures is very, very strong, because the people writing the policy know what they want to happen, and they are going to be inclined to include procedures to tell you how to prevent that from happening, and they need to back off from that a bit. So this is one reason to circulate drafts widely, because at the draft stage, your staff should be able to raise their hands and say, this is too detailed, we can't follow this, this is not how we do things, or this won't work, this will take too much time, and give you a chance to back off. Or the staff should be able to say, we don't understand what it is you want to accomplish here, which tells you that it's too general. So that's one reason to circulate drafts and get a lot of input.
That was a really interesting question.
Yeah.
David from Rwanda has this question. Where do we place the role of curators in collection management and conservation in general?
Okay, curator is an interesting term, because we use that to mean a lot of different things. You know, it comes from the Latin word that means to care for. And traditionally in museums, that job, the title of curator, went to the person who took care of the collection. But nowadays, in a lot of museums, that is not true. If you go into particularly a natural history museum or a science museum of almost any kind, curator is used as a synonym for researcher, because they spend most of their time, curators do, doing research. But if you're a small local history museum, the curator is likely to be doing the hands-on collection care. So I would go back and define what you mean by curator. And usually this is a person in charge of a collection at some level. But you have to be really clear about that. And this is a big problem in jobs, to the point that when my students are looking for jobs, I now tell them, ignore the job title. The first thing to look at is read the job description. If that is the job you want, then you apply for it. But don't apply just because it says curator or collection manager or something like that. So we use that word in a lot of different ways. Ultimately, though, you should have a hierarchy in your institution, and a curator should be a person that is a specialist in that area, that is able to make the big decisions about how a collection overall is taken care of. But the day-to-day maintenance, the day-to-day care is usually handed off to someone like a collection manager or a registrar. But it depends on the institution. Just bear in mind, curator means a lot of different things to different people.
Lorenzo, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes. Hi, hello. I'm calling from. I'm here from Italy, and thank you for your presentation. It was very useful for me, and I'm very interested to know, in your mind, how many people and who are people involved with collection management. I'll ask you this because, you see, as you may know, in Italy, the problem of people working in museums is very delicate, as there are some positions that are not recognized yet by our cultural system. For example, the position of the registrar is not officially recognized by the ministry. So there are now many people working as registrars in Italy, but as a matter of fact, they were not employed to do that formally. And when we come up to collection management, the situation is even more complicated, because in Italy, collection management is under the care of a curator, so of an art historian, or anyway, a scholar who, let's say, has wide experience from a research point of view, and in order to do everything which is required by collection management, so care and preventive, services, should know much more than that. So I would like to understand, in a collection management equipe, in the collection management staff, in the crew, how many people are there? So a registrar, a preparator, an art handler, a storage manager, how many?
Well, in part, this depends on how large the collection is, because a very large collection, a curator will not be able to maintain the work of curation and collection care. It depends. And the word registrar, for example, this position has been around since about 1900. It didn't become professionalized until around the 1960s, 1970s. And in the late 1970s, they began creating the position in the United States and in Great Britain, at least, of collection manager, which basically includes the job of a registrar, but a part of the job of a curator. And the reason for this professionalization of positions is the growth of collections themselves. They got to be big enough that one person could not handle everything. And particularly with a curator, we are expecting these people to be an area expert. So be that whether they are in a history or natural history or art museum, they are expected to be an expert in a particular academic area, but we can't also expect them to know all about collections care, particularly now that the fundamental part of collections care is preventive conservation. That's a whole new area of knowledge to be acquired. So I would argue that you want a curator that's a area specialist and overall in charge, but you want a collection manager or a registrar, whatever the title is you want to use, treated as a professional who is in charge of the care of the collection, the maintenance, the monitoring, storage environment, implementing preventive conservation, all of those issues. The problem is getting that professionalization to occur. And I've worked in some in Europe and a lot in Latin America. Latin America has a situation very similar to what you're describing in Italy, in that registrars and collection managers are now doing most of the work that they would do if they were in, say, the United Kingdom or Canada or the United States, but they're not recognized widely as professionals. And that needs to be changed. And you change that by forming professional organizations and pushing for that professionalization. So there is an organization of called ARCS, which is the Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists, that is relatively new. I have been on their board of directors in the past, and they are pushing for professionalization of these positions worldwide. And I think it's important to look at organizations like that, how they get together, how they try to advance knowledge in the area, to point out that what they are doing is making life easier for the curators. Back in the 70s, when collection managers began to be added to American museums, there was a lot of resistance on the part of the curators who felt it was threatening their job, when in fact it was to make their job easier for them and help divide those positions out. And I don't think now you would have any curators wanting to go back to the days when there were no collection managers, because they're widely appreciated. And initially, registrars and collection managers were considered different positions. Registrars mainly dealt with paperwork, collection managers with the hands-on collection. But over time, those jobs have merged to the point they are now synonyms. And when you say collection manager or registrar, you are almost always talking about very similar duties.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very useful. Thank you.
The aforementioned person signed up for the class in July from the Botanic Garden has a question. Nadia asks, can you describe what the relationship between policy and strategy should be?
Sure. Strategy should tell you where you are going and what you plan to do. Policy should tell you how you're going to make that happen. So policy should be prescriptive, not predictive. Your strategy should be your big goals, your aims. We're not describing where you are now, but where you're headed. Your policy should be a tool that's going to help you implement your strategy. It's like the difference in policies and plans. Plans tell you where you want to go and what you want to do in the long term, but your policies help you get to that spot.
As part of the last answer John gave, he mentioned ARCS. I dropped the link to ARCS in the chat for those of you interested. We have one more question from Anna. Do you know the difference, know of a difference between collection development policies versus collection management policies?
Sure. A collection development policy tells you what you want to do to achieve an ideal collection. It tells you what sorts of things that you want to collect, what areas you want to collect in, it establishes the criteria for what comes in. Your policy should be based on that plan. And so your policy, for instance, your accession policy should work off of that plan to help guide the accessionings day to day. But your policy should not give you that long range view of where your collection is headed. That is collection development. The reason for that is your collection development is going to change over time with the mission of the institution or with changes in curators or focus of the curators. And your policy should be directed more towards making the plan work no matter what the plan is. So your plans are your long range predictive. Ideally, this is what we want to achieve things. Your policies are more designed to guide you functioning day to day. But the two are very closely fit together because your policies should be based on your plans. And we didn't have time to go into all the details in this webinar since we only had a short amount of time, but ideally, you would have plans, and that would also be a part of what you use to develop your policies.
All right. Well, we're close to the end. Does anyone else have any questions as we finish up? I want to thank you all for coming today. Great turnout. Very exciting to see the interest level for this. I don't think John or I expected quite so many people to express interest in this webinar. But we welcome the opportunity to share knowledge and with all of you and answer some really interesting questions. So thank you for that. If you have any questions about museum study, you can reach me at this email address that I will drop in the chat, bradbreedyhoff@museumstudy.com. And if you have questions about collection management policies, you'll want to talk to John. He is clearly the expert, and that is his email address also in the chat. So again, thank you all. I did record this. We're doing a second one of these in 5 hours. And I'm going to attempt to combine the Q&A from both sessions along with one of the presentations and then put it up on our YouTube channel. And once it's up on the YouTube channel, I'll send email out to everyone to let you know. So if you want to go back and review it, you can. All right, with that, thank you again all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was awesome.